Hello, Les Williams here. This is Traveler for DND5e players. The goal of our session together is to help experienced players of D&D learn the very basics of Traveler. Both games have their roots in the same primordial soup, if you will, having started in 1974 and 1977 respectively, so it's not surprising that they share a lot of similar features and approaches. Traveler is to modern-day sci-fi RPGs as D&D is to modern-day fantasy RPGs. Something like that cool granddad that's still fun to hang out with, a bit of the old school remixed with the modern age. If you're an experienced Dungeons & Dragons 5e player, you'll find picking up the modern version of Traveler very easy, as you don't really know it yet, but you already know the basics. Your referee will help you with the details as they come up. My hope is at the end of this, you'll feel very comfortable jumping into a Traveler-based game. There are a lot of ways to look at this, but perhaps we should start by looking at the character sheets, something that a D&D player knows well. Then we'll work up to how we got there. In D&D, we have 6 characteristics that range from 3 to 18 based on a point buy or a 3 dice 6 roll, which is throwing a regular dice 6 3 times and adding them together. Those characteristics are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. You can see the scores in this example sheet is the numbers in the circle at the bottom. Now the dice modifier is the large number that you see there, and it's really for gameplay is the important thing. These will have negative values for low characteristics, 0 for a normal range, and positive values for extremely high scores. In Traveler, we have 6 characteristics as well, that range from 2 to 12 based on a 2 dice 6 roll. Those characteristics are strength, dexterity, endurance, intellect, education, and social, and rarely psi. If these look very familiar to the ones that we know from just a minute ago, then that's because they are. These characteristics will be strung together to form a shorthand called the UPP, or the Universal Persona Profile. In this case, 493C57-0, where C represents the 12. What you see in this character sheet is a dice modifier, or DM, that will be negative values for low characteristics, 0 for the normal range, or positive values for extremely high scores, just like we see in D&D. Also, just like in D&D, we add those DMs when a skill we use is based on that characteristic. Unlike D&D, we have some flexibility on what characteristic goes with the skill based on the circumstance and the narrative. If you've heard of Traveler previously, but not played, you probably heard it's the game that can kill you during character creation. Well, that was true in the early days, and practically, it's somewhat true today. Just as in D&D, there are several options you have for how you gin up your characters. In D&D, you have a lot of control on how you set up starting characters, even to the point of completely optimizing if you so wish. In Traveler, it's like you're headed out of high school with grand plans and then life happens. I like to think of this as the Traveler character minigame, and is best completed with your other crewmates. When you finish, you have stories to tell about how you were all involved in each other's lives and only have each other to blame for your successes and challenges that you're about to face. In D&D, the feature most players will know are hit points and armor class. D&D hit points can be thought of as heroic points, meaning how much of a beating a character can take before some kind of effects, like the possibility of dying, kicks in. Generally speaking, until you hit that point, your character functions like it always does. Even if you're on death's very door, down and out, there are many ways for your character to have even just one of these points returned, and in most cases, they're back in the fray. No worse for the wear. Not so in Traveler. Combat and damage are deadly. Here's my first Traveler tip. If someone points a weapon at you, dodge or dive for cover, because a bullet or laser to the face will likely kill you. This is why Traveler is known as a harder science epic with fantasy elements. If you want to think hit points, like in D&D, then your strength, dex, and endurance total can be thought of as your hit points. In our example here, that total would be 4 plus 9 plus 3, or 16 hit points. Unlike D&D, This will not change much during the short life of your character. Hey, they were old to start with, so don't feel too bad about it. Travel characters have already led full lives if they survived character generation. When you take damage in Traveler, you're hurt immediately, reducing your endurance score, therefore modifying your endurance damage modifier down. When that goes to 0, then your dex or your strength, your choice in most games, is reduced as well, along with your DM. When you have 2 characteristics down to 0, then you're down. Unconscious. You lose all 3, you're dead. Dead. Of course, in D&D, you want to know your armor class. This is a difficulty roll target for the bad guys to hit you and chop away at those heroic points, hit points we talked about earlier. If the baddie's combat skill check roll, plus their rank benefit and proficiency modifiers, and the characteristic DM up to that point is added all together to that number or more, they got you. Maybe it affects your character, but usually not, until the last moment possible when that last hit point is gone. In Traveler, as in all kinds of skill checks, you'll roll your check, which we'll cover next, and if it is an 8 or higher, you're hit. If you're wearing armor, then the damage is reduced that much, but everything that gets through hurts, and the effects are immediate, as your characteristics are reduced and likely your DM's. Okay, we are almost there. I think the last thing we need to cover in this 5e to Traveler chat are skill checks. We'll lump combat skill checks and all other skill checks into one group as they basically work all the same way. It's just in one situation you're using a combat skill like melee or laser, and the other is more mundane, such as investigate or carouse. The list of skills here is for mundane skills, but there's also a list for melee, heavy weapons, and so on in D&D. Success is based on a difficulty class. Being a DM in D&D and a Traveler ref since the beginning of these games, I can tell you with some certainty that this is a sliding scale. What is medium or average difficulty to a starting character in D&D is much different than in upper levels, as you would expect. Your target number for each creature or character could be different. The calculation of your effectiveness, the success check, is your related DM or ability modifier, your rank in the skill, proficiency modifiers, along with any situational modifiers. In certain situations you might even have an advantage or disadvantage on the check, which you D&D players already know what that means. If the total, when it's all said and done, is equal to or exceeds the difficulty set by your GM, which you may or may not be known, then you're successful. In Traveler, all the skills, including those for combat, are listed in the skills area. There is no proficiency bonus as in D&D because there are levels for characters. Once you have your rank in a skill, it only improves through training or experience. The calculation of your effectiveness, the success check, is your related DM, ability modifier, your rank in the skill, along with any situational modifiers. In certain situations, you might even have a boon or bane on the check, which works just like advantage or disadvantage in D&D. If your total, when it's all said and done, is equal to or exceeds 8 in most cases, you're successful. In the case of combat, you'd roll out the damage and apply it to your target. Of course, it's important to know who goes first when the timing is tight, as in combat. We call this kind of skill check an initiative check. In D&D, this is a dexterity check using your dex DM on a d20 roll. In Traveler, all skill checks are 2d6, which we abbreviate 2d since all the dice are 6-sided, but in the case of initiative, you have the option of using the dexterity DM or the intellect DM. In Traveler, you can act faster or act smarter than the bad guys. We're getting close to my 10-minute or less goal for this quick guide to Traveler for 5e D&D players. I hope you find it helpful to give you the confidence in the mechanics so you might try exploring the worlds of Traveler.